The British Empire was at its height by the early 20th century. It was described as the empire on which the sun never sets because its dominion covered the furthest reaches of the globe where the sun shone anywhere in British territory. Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic were among the many colonies dominated by Britain. But among them, most prominently, was America. Britain ruled North America for over a century, from 1607 until 1776, when the United States declared its independence, marking the start of the American Revolution and the break from British rule. But how could Britain lose America? How could this once powerful empire, with all its wealth, strong navy, and fierce army, lose such a massive territory? The fact is, Britain made a series of critical mistakes that sparked rebellion and caused its defeat in the American Revolutionary War in 1783. Stay tuned as we uncover how Britain lost America. Ever since the British colonized America in 1607, tensions had been rising between the colonies and the Crown. By 1763, Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, dominating its French and Spanish rivals and claiming new territory in India, the West Indies, and above all, North America. From the early to mid-18th century, the relationship between Britain and America has been one of salutary neglect. The American colonies were left to manage their own affairs, while Britain turned its attention to more lucrative endeavors in the West Indies and India. For a long time, each colony had its own government that decided which taxes should be paid and collected. While this gave the colonists more autonomy, it turned out to be a grave mistake. They were emboldened and grew ever more entitled as they considered themselves the Crown's equal and saw any interference as an act of tyranny. By 1764, Britain faced a massive debt crisis from the 7 Years' War, and Parliament expected the colonies to recoup some of its debts. But it was the manner in which the British demanded taxation that was mistaken and would incite rebellion years later. Britain viewed America as a child belonging to its parents' empire. In fact, the Crown believed it had the right to impose taxes on the colonies for its own defense. But the colonists did not see it that way. To them, this was tyranny that greatly threatened their freedom. In 1764, Britain proposed 2 new revenue-raising taxes: the Sugar Act, which in fact decreased taxes on foreign sugar and molasses, but only in an effort to ensure effective collection, and the Stamp Act, which taxed all commercial and legal documents, from playing cards to land grants, and from newspapers to attorney licenses. But to Britain's surprise, the reaction in the colonies was an uproar. The Stamp Act particularly hit merchants, lawyers, and business owners hard, and so they condemned it in the newspapers and a flood of pamphlets. As a result, taxes never got collected because of widespread discontent and incessant riots. Eventually, Benjamin Franklin helped sway the British to repeal the taxes, but that only made things worse. It made the Americans believe they could push back against anything the British wanted, and so the road to rebellion was set and the die was cast. In 1767, the British placed taxes on colonial imports in an effort to fix the country's spiraling debt crisis. These taxes were known as the Townshend Acts. The British believed the colonists would be more than willing to pay taxes on imported goods rather than on items produced locally. However, they were terribly mistaken, as they underestimated how fiercely independent the colonists were. The Americans protested that they had no representation in the British Parliament and cannot accept taxation without representation. They flooded the streets once again with pamphlets that spread far and wide and managed to unify colonial opposition against British rule. In turn, tax collectors were beaten to a pulp, chased out of town, and forced to resign. Tax documents were destroyed, effigies of royal governors were burned or hanged from liberty trees. British officials were tarred, feathered, and paraded through the streets in a humiliating display. They organized a boycott of British goods subject to taxation and began harassing British customs commissioners. The Americans made it clear they weren't going to pay taxes. Fed up by acts of dissent against their rule, the Royal Crown sent troops to occupy the Boston harbor in an effort to quell resistance and collect taxes, but this only increased hostility. On the night of March 5, 1770, tensions boiled over when 8 British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonial protesters, killing 5 Americans. This event became known as the Boston Massacre, and news of it spread like wildfire, sparking rebellion all over America. Even still, the British were dead set in their acts of taxation thereafter, but at no avail. They thought they could make tons of revenue from taxing the Americans, but they were deeply mistaken. The money the British withstood to gain from taxes was so insignificant that it would have made no difference to the Crown in solving the economic crisis. And so the stubbornness to tax the Americans primed the colonists for their eventual uprising against the British and would lead to the eventual loss of the colonies. When war finally broke out in 1775, Britain seemed invincible. It possessed the most powerful navy and a ferocious army that conquered the New World. And yet, the British were greatly disadvantaged as they faced a logistical nightmare. Britain had to fight an elusive and transient enemy across 3,000 miles of tumultuous ocean. Military supplies took at least 6 weeks to travel by ship from England and usually arrived late and in poor condition. Orders from London took a long time to reach the generals in America, and by the time instructions arrived, the situation on the ground had often changed completely, leaving British commanders fighting a war based on outdated intelligence. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The British fought the Americans according to the rules of traditional European warfare. They believed that capturing major cities like New York and Philadelphia would crush the rebellion, but they couldn't have been more wrong. America was a vast and treacherous land. Capturing a capital city was meaningless if the enemy simply fled to the countryside to fight another day. In fact, George Washington knew he couldn't defeat the massive British army directly and single-handedly. That's why he instead resorted to a defensive strategy of evading the British and outflanking them to disrupt British operations, force costly retreats, and prolong the revolution. This not only revitalized American morale, but it sapped Britain's resolve and sealed its fate. In 1777, the British devised a complex plan to slice the colonies in two by marching an army south from Canada to link up with forces coming north from New York. It was a plan that required perfect timing and coordination. But due to arrogance and miscommunication, General William Howe abandoned the plan and marched his army to capture Philadelphia, a pointless affair that offered no strategic value. This left General John Burgoyne's Northern Army isolated, outnumbered, and trapped in the dense forests of New York. Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga was the turning point of the war, proving the Americans could win and convincing France to join the fight against Britain. In 1780, after failing in the north, Britain turned its attention south, laboring under the illusion that a silent majority of loyalists would rise up and restore royal authority. However, the British were yet again gravely mistaken. No one in the south wanted to help them after they had raided the countryside and brutalized its residents to secure supplies and foodstuffs. Instead, British General Lord Cornwallis found himself chased across the Carolinas, his army exhausted and bleeding from 1,000 cuts inflicted by American guerrilla fighters. Cornered and cut off from supply, Cornwallis retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, where he fell into a great trap. Surrounded by the American army on land and the French navy at sea, there was no hope for him, and he was forced to surrender in 1781. The might of the British Empire was brought to an end on September 3, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, which ended the war and formally recognized the independence of the United States. Britain had proven it could win battles and conquer cities, but through poor strategy and logistical failure, they ultimately lost the war and with it the American continent. The loss of America was not a failure of British strength, but a failure of British wisdom. The empire possessed the ships, the soldiers, and the wealth to crush any enemy, yet the British were defeated by their own arrogance and stubbornness. By underestimating the independent spirit of the colonists and failing to compromise a treaty of self-government with them, Britain sparked a revolution and orchestrated its own defeat. The loss of America remained a badge of shame for the crown, but it marked a new beginning for the new world, a new age that was dawning in the West. What other lessons can we learn from Britain's loss of America? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos on the mistakes of history, support the channel, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the upcoming episodes. Thank you for watching and see you very soon.